Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Everything, and I am coming back at you with another Wargaming in Miniature video. We are going to go ahead and touch on an old subject, which was my Black Powder boot camp. I did a boot camp in first edition Black Powder, and I overlooked a pretty vital piece of information, and I just reviewing my old videos, I realized that I had neglected to even discuss this, talk about it, share any insight on it. So I'm going to create a new Black Powder boot camp video and input it into my playlist. This video is going to be focusing on unit sizes and formations, how to base them, and how they should look on the table. This is pretty important, and I'm surprised that I didn't go over it in the first boot camp. I'm not redoing the boot camp because first and second edition only had some minor changes, and I did a video explaining those changes. But this topic, the unit sizes and formations, I seem to have glazed over, so we're going to go ahead and go over that today. There's one additional thing that I want to point out. These formations that I'm going to be discussing are from the first and second edition Black Powder rules, and also from the Albion Triumphant Book 2 or Volume 2. Because I personally focus on the 100 Days campaign when I'm building out my armies, 90% of these formations will be usable with any other army, but if there's any specifics like Russians or Austrians or something like that, please refer to your own campaign books. But 90% of them are in the Black Powder rules, but there are a couple of extra formations that are in the Albion Triumphant book, and we will be going over those as well. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is unit size. When it comes to unit size and scale, I've come to the realization that one figure in a battalion represents about 25 men. So a 4-figure base represents about 100 men. A 6-base battalion would represent approximately a 600-man unit, because you got 24 figures, 6 bases, etc. Some people will mount their standard size units larger or smaller, with more figures or less figures than is the standard accepted amount, which is 24. But that's okay. They like to have, like I've seen some units mounted like this, where they have 6 figures on a base, and you have like 36 figures representing a standard size unit instead of the standard 24. Personally, due to the size of my table and size of my playing area and the cost of the figures, etc., I am sticking with let me back up, and also the universal nature of staying with the rules. If I encounter another player and he says, hey, let's play a game, and he says, I'm going to bring my French army, can you bring your British army? Then we would be able to play if we're based the same. So I stick with the more popular basing style than the more aesthetic looking basing style. This is going to cost you 150% of what this is going to cost you, right? So you're looking at, let's just say this cost $30, where this would cost $20. So that's just up to you how you want to do it. Now, if you're basing both of your armies this way, both sides of the table, or if all your friends are basing it this way, then definitely, yeah, go with that way. But if you're basing it but I personally base 4 per base, and you'll see that because I've got a number of figures out here that I'm going to show you different formations and how they're based different sizes. Okay, now back to the size of the units. This is the second edition book. The second edition book doesn't really talk about, they basically eliminated the whole verbiage of how many figures are in a unit. They don't even really ever talk about that. What they talk about is when the unit is deployed in line, how many millimeters is the frontage of the unit. And that's where they go 200 to 250 millimeters is your standard unit, and then they talk about large being, a different size, and then small being a different size. So really they don't even focus on that. So you can, if you're referring to the rules, 200 to 250 millimeters is your unit frontage, where they talk about small and large units. Well, here we got a chart right here that says 200 to 250. A small is 120 to 150, and a large is 260 to 325. So they're saying as long as your formations fall into these areas, it does not matter how many figures are on your base. You could have 1 figure per base, you could have 10 figures per base. It doesn't matter as long as your frontage falls within this category. That doesn't help me when it comes to how many figures do I need. I have to figure all that out on my own? No. So what I've done, and I'm just going to close this book. So what I've done is I've referred back to the first edition book, because that's where most of my armies were based for initially anyway. And this also shows the unit sizes and the unit dimensions to be approximately the same, 200 to 250. But in addition to that, what they've done is they've said if you're infantry, this is how many models you should have in a, or let's say if you're infantry, cavalry, or artillery, this is how many units or figures you should have in a standard size unit, and a large unit, a small unit, and a tiny unit. And this is what I use as a reference to go by. I like, okay, this gives me some hard numbers, and that's what I want to share with you. This says 24 to 30 models in a standard size. Okay, so those people, which is not me, that mount 3 per base in a frontage, and so they have 6 models on a base, they wind up having 36 models in a 6 base unit. They would have to play with 5 bases to fall into the standard size unit, and 5 bases is not going to work in these rules, and we'll get into that in the unit, in the formations here in just a minute. Okay, so I go with 24. It just seems to be what they package their units in their boxes. You buy a box of British line infantry, you get 24 models, everything's good. Okay, and then Cav, it says 12 to 16. Well, I use 12. I put 2 on a base and then 6 bases, got 12. And artillery, it says 1 gun and crew. So an artillery unit is going to be 1 model, not 2 models that you see a lot of those players out there that have those 6-figure frontage bases. They like to put 2 cannons out there and call that a battery. Well, they're just trying to upscale to look impressive, in my opinion, which does look impressive, but it's unnecessary. There's no need to do that. 1 gun and crew. Okay, a large unit, we'll get into that, but this says 36 or 18, and then small would be 12 or 6 to 8, and then tiny is 5 to 6 or 3 to 4. Okay, so the way I do it, and this might or might not be the way you like to do it, but this makes it easy for me. Each size down is from standard is half the size above. So if that's 24, this goes to 12, and this goes to 6. And that's how I field my units. So I go 24, 12, and 6. And large, I just add 2 additional bases. So instead of 24 figures, I add 8 to that. It winds up being 32. So it's not a full 36 for large, but that's okay. You'll see why it's going to be okay once I pull my models out. Okay, so that's how I base it, and that is in the first edition book, and that's on page 10 if you're curious. All right, I got a French unit out here, 6 bases, as you can see. Now I want to dispel a misunderstanding. It's one of my misunderstandings. It's a misunderstanding that I've seen on some playthroughs or some gameplay videos. Once I realized that I had this misunderstanding, it's one of the reasons why I reviewed what I said about the formations in my original boot camps, and that's when I realized that I did not have a video that described this. So luckily I didn't say anything wrong, but I do want to explain something. This is not a legitimate formation. This is a false formation. Do not think that this is a formation. I thought that this would be a French attack column, right? I thought that this is a French attack column, and I was incorrect. One of the reasons, well, let me read it straight from the book, and it will explain why this is not a French attack column. And I noticed that in first edition and second edition, it's worded exactly the same. It says, attack column. An attack column is a regular formation of infantry between 3 and 6 ranks deep. Okay, well this does have 3 to 6 ranks deep. That's no problem. And at least as many files as it has ranks. Okay, well this only has 4 files. So it cannot have 4 files and 6 ranks. If hypothetically I only had 16 figures, which a lot of my basing used to be like this because I was a miser, at least as many files as it has ranks is okay. This is okay. This is too deep. That's too many too deep. It's still within the 6, but you got to have as many files as you do ranks. So the way you fix this is you take this figure and you place it there, and you take these figures and you place them there. Now let's see if this fits into the rules. Between 3 and 6 ranks deep. Well, it's got 4 ranks, so it's okay. That's perfect. And as many files as it has, at least as many files as it has ranks. Well, it's got 4 ranks and it's got 6 files. So this is a French attack column, or just plain old, this is an attack column. This is an attack column. Okay, the next formation, and we'll continue to use these figures here. The next formation is line formation. Well, line formation is when you take all of your bases and you place them side by side in a line. Everyone out there knows this is a line formation. This is a regular formation, 2 ranks deep, just like that. In the case of cavalry, 1 or 2 ranks deep. That is considered a line formation because it's 1 or 2 ranks deep. If I was to take these and put them, that is also considered a line. For cavalry, it's 1 or 2 ranks deep. You might think, well, this kind of looks like an attack column, but no, it's cavalry, so it's only 2 ranks, and this is only 2 ranks. So it says, ideally, the line should be a straight line, but if circumstances dictate that the line kinks or bends to the ground, you can still do that. So let's say there's a giant cliff face here, like these guys could kind of like bend around the cliff, that's fine. They still consider this a line. You try to get it as close to possible like this, that's okay. But it's still considered out of formation. So what that means is if this unit wanted to move from this, it would still have to spend one of its moves redressing its ranks, either in line or column, right? Or whatever formation it's going to use. And then you move and you're in that new formation. So we went over line, we went over attack column. Now there's something called march column. Okay, let's talk about march column. Remember that first formation I talked about with the French that I said was not a legal formation? Well, I misspoke, because this formation, it's not a attack column, but it does still count as a march column. A lot of misconception is that all of your figures have to be like this to be a march column, where that does qualify for a march column. You do not have to be like this. Let me explain, per the rules, what a march column consists of. A march column must be between 2 and 4 figures wide. So it could be 4 figures wide, or it could be 2 figures wide, or 3, depending on how you mount them. Between 2 and 4 figures wide. And it must have more ranks than files. So as you know, this has 6 ranks, which is more than the 4 files. So this can be a march column. If I was to put it like that, that would also be a march column, because it's between 2 and 4 files, and it has way more ranks than it has files. If I was cavalry, let's say I was cavalry, and now I've got 12 figures here. Let's say I wanted to go into march column. Would I be able to go 4 figures wide like that, and then only 3 files deep? I could not, because this does not have more. It doesn't even say equal to. It says you have to have more ranks. So can I go 3 deep? Can I go 3 wide? I certainly could if I broke this down into individual figures. I could put a third there and a third there, which I don't have marked as individuals. I could go 3 by 4, and that could be a march column if I wanted to do that. But when I was basing these, I was just assuming that I would go like that, because between 2 and 4 wide by more deep. But yes, you can go 3 wide by 4 deep if you wanted to. All right, now let's talk about, now we haven't really talked about size and unit basing yet. I'm going to save that for after the formations. Let's talk about skirmish order. This is a loose formation often used by lightly armed troops for skirmishing. Okay, skirmishing usually means that you've got figures spread out individually. Skirmish order. This is a loose formation often used by lightly armed troops for skirmishing and by other units infiltrating broken terrain. So a lot of these units, like these infantry units, are allowed to enter skirmish order when entering like forests and things like that. So when they enter the forest, they have to deploy into a formation similar to this. But remember, these guys are based 4 per stand. So what you would do is just spread the stands out, saying that these guys are in skirmish. And you would space them however you'd like, as long as they're about 1 to 2 bases apart. And the reason why that is is because this is 2 base width, right? Approximately, right? So if I was to have this guy there and this guy there, that's more than 1 base. That's almost 2 bases apart. So you could skirmish. I would just skirmish with them anywhere between 1 and 2 inches apart. It's also sometimes referred to as open order. When a unit forms into skirmish order, the models are spaced 1 to 2 inches apart, and they form a chain or loose mass. Yeah, if they're based like this, you just space them a couple of bases apart. If they're based like this, then you just base them that way. There is a formation called mixed order or mixed formation, and that's when you have a unit. Let's put these guys back a little bit. Now I base almost all my standard units in mixed, with the expectation that I might form a mixed formation. Mixed uses a formed element and then it deploys skirmishers in its front. And it says some kinds of regular infantry can form into mixed order, and you will find that on the unit capabilities in the various army books that you use. But let's just talk about these guys right here. You take as close as possible to 1/3 of the unit, and when you have 6 bases, it's pretty easy to figure 1/3. 1/3 is obviously 2 bases. The separated body now skirmishes no more than 2 inches to their front. And what I do personally is I take my, just to make it pretty easy, I take my elite companies and I split them into 2-figure bases, and then I leave them on it like those are my magnetic bases. And then that way I can skirmish with these guys up front like so, within a couple of inches of the main formed unit. And this is where I've deployed skirmishers. Now these guys can kind of go however I want, but they do need to stay in the front of the element. And the front, remember, is a 45-degree angle, so I could kind of do one of these numbers. A benefit of this is when shooting at this unit now, they are considered to be skirmishers. So it gives them kind of like a protection, harder to hit this unit. Okay, now the advanced rule for mixed formation is that you can actually be in an attack column, which is 4x4 in this case, and still have 1/3 of your figures deployed as skirmishers in front. If you do not have bases mounted individually, which is also a really good way to deploy skirmishers. This is obviously skirmishers. But if you don't have them based individually, or if you don't base them double, I base them double just for the ease of movement, and it helps with them not being knocked over. If you don't have that and you want, like you only have 4-figure bases in your attack column, and you want to take 1/3 of them and deploy them out front, you would just take 2 bases, just like as if those other units moving through the woods. You just put them out in front and just say you've got your skirmishers deployed, and that's perfectly legal as well. So you really don't have to mount anybody on a single figure if you don't want. You can mount them all on the 4-figure bases if you want, but it's just easier to identify when they're mounted like this or if they're mounted like this. That's really personal preference, because the rules let you do it either way. Now, we're not talking about the advantages or disadvantages of being in skirmish, the pluses and minuses to shooting and all that. We're not talking about any of that. We're just talking about what's a legal formation. Warband. Okay, now warband really doesn't apply to majority of the Napoleonics battles, and that's what I'm focusing on. But remember, this is black powder, and black powder has a long a wide range of genres, and one of them or multiples of them might have units that are mounted in a warband, like the Sudan or maybe Zulus, something like that. So let's take a look and see what warband says. This is the default formation for most combatives, irregular units such as the Sudanese and other wild tribesmen. These fierce warriors fight in a dense mass, either a formal arrangement of warriors or something more than akin to a mob. The warband therefore forms a rough square or oblong between 3 and 6 ranks deep. Okay, so that's 3 and 6 ranks, right? That's 4 ranks. So that would be considered okay as a warband. Okay, the next formation is square. Square formation. It is not technically a square when you deploy it on the table. So when you've got your unit... Okay, so a square is going to look a lot like an attack column. It's a formation made up of infantry units to try to make them immune to close attack, especially from cavalry. Okay, so the way I do it in like Napoleon's battles would be that I would take the back rank and just turn them around, and basically you've got a forward and a backward formation. If you only had 4 bases, you could do the same this way. You got 2 to the front, 2 to the back. If I had 4 bases, I would turn one base to every side. Now I'm not putting a hole in the middle of my formation, as you might notice. I'm not going like this. That is not a legitimate square. All your bases are supposed to be adjacent. So this could represent a square. Turning the figures in the back backwards, that could represent a square. But if you've got six, what I would do is take one of the back and face it to the side, and one of the back and face it to the side. So you've got your normal frontage, right? And then you've got a side flank, and then you've got a rear flank. Like you got your rear sides covered, front covered. And that would be a square. Could you be in a deeper formation and form square? Like something like that, and then you would have a couple of units facing to the side, a couple of units, a unit facing to the rear, a unit like this. This is a legitimate square as well, as long as they're all together and you've got figures facing out in every direction. Count that as a square. Remember that a brigade usually didn't form one large, or let me rephrase that. When the brigade formed a square, usually each side of the square would be a company of 100 or so men. And so this is showing like 100 here, and you can just hypothetical figure it out. Okay, so a legitimate square is like this, or something like that, or you could even go 2 on every side, 2 to the front, 2 to the side, 1. As long as there's somebody facing in every direction, I count that as a square. Now there is something called a brigade square, which is an advanced rule. That's when you have your entire brigade form a square. So each battalion in the unit forms a side to the square. Yeah, it's not considered a change of formation. You're not actually adjusting their formation. You're just positioning them on the table using movement. And if you have a battalion facing in all 4 directions, touching each other, then that would be considered a brigade square, and they would still benefit from the square formation rule. Okay, and just as a rules add-on. I think I talked about this during my initial boot camp, but to change formation, it costs 1 movement action. Like when you roll your command and you get that extra, when you get that 1 movement or 2 movements or 3 movements, if you get at least 1, then you can change formation. And it doesn't use up any movement, so you don't get to move anywhere. You just use 1 of your movement actions. So let's say, and I did it like this because I wanted to put my command stand in the middle. Let's say this attack column wanted to change into a line. Well, what you do is you expend 1 of your movement actions, and you can adjust the angle that this is facing, so you can turn him to face your opponent or whoever, and at that point you would put your figures in a line, and this guy could go to either side, just depending on how you wanted to do it, trying to keep this unit, the command element, touching the middle. And then there would be your line. And then he would act from there. So if you had 2 actions, one would be to change into the line, and then your second move could be to move. Now you can do it the other way around. You can move first and then change into a line, or whatever. Now let's say this unit wanted to change formation into a march column. You do basically the same thing. You pull these guys off to the side, right? You adjust the facing of your command element, and then you place these guys how you want in a march column. Now remember that 1 movement action at this scale is 12 inches. So if for some reason I had a line that was out to there, and then I changed and I wanted to put the march column facing in this direction, I could not take this base and put it all the way over there. But I'm going to argue that point, because that's more than 12 inches. I'm going to argue that base could be the one that goes there, and the base that was there could go there. So yes, I don't care how many figures you have, you're always going to be able to position them correctly, because it's always going to be less than 12 inches. Or 18 inches in the case of Cav or whatever. Okay, so don't worry about measuring the distance on the change formation, because you got 12 inches of movement. You should be able to handle that with no problem. All right, so now this is where it gets tricky, because every nation in the 100 Days campaign has rules on unique formations that they can perform. Luckily, they fall into pretty much 2 categories, or maybe 3 categories, but they fall into the British standard operating procedure and the French standard operating procedure. Like the Allies or the minor countries, they're going to fall under one of those 2. Okay, so let's talk about the British. The British have special infantry rules. They have something called the 4 deep line. Okay, so the British have something called the 4 deep line. I'm going to put a French unit side by side to them. So we talked about the attack column. The attack column is a French formation. A formation that looks exactly like the French unit, but British is called the 4 deep line. This is not an attack column. This is. They look the same. They're 2 different nations. Tricky. It has to be 3 bases wide and 2 bases deep. Represents the 4 deep line. I'm getting into the rules, but basically it is considered a narrow line. So normally, remember that straight 2 bases wide, full length, line gets the full fire value of your unit, and an attack column gets a extremely reduced firing value. The 4 deep line gets your line fire value, but with a -1. So it basically reduces their firing capability, but not as severe as an attack column. And a 4 deep line can form a mixed formation. Okay, British. We're still on the British. They cannot form an attack column. Okay, which is good, because if they did, it would look crazy, because the 4 deep line and the attack columns look exactly the same. So if you see a British unit like this, you know it's in a 4 deep line. If you see a French unit like this, you know it's an attack column. They do have an attack column, but it's used differently. And this is it. It's called a column of companies. The British can form something called a column of companies. It's single file, and it's 1 company wide. So, as we know, each of these bases represent a company, and being single file, we would put it something like this. So the way it's represented is we reduce the length of the column. We place 4 bases rather than the prescribed 6. So if you've got a unit like this, that would be a march column, where if I take these 2 bases off and I set them to the side, maybe off table somewhere, this is considered a column of companies. So it's not a full march column, but it's also not an attack column. But it does count as an attack column when shot at. All right, now some units have what's called a rifle mixed formation, right? And so it's the same as a normal mixed formation. It just means that your skirmishers are equipped with rifles. So if it says rifle mixed formation, all that means is you get to shoot like they had rifles when you're firing from the skirmishers. Mixed formation is the same. Must form square is per the black powder rule. It says that any battalion from any unit can be ordered to lie down. Some of the advantages, and you would put a little marker next to them saying that they're lying down. If you are kind of like me and you've got your skirmishers mounted like this, I could probably take something like that and represent that they're lying down. You can mark it however you want. Figure out a little token or something that represents them lying down. If they're contacted in melee, they're instantly destroyed. So that's scary. Don't lie down when you're close to the enemy. And if artillery shoots at them from medium or long range, they have to re-roll any hits. So that's always good. There's other rules too. Let's move on to cavalry, right? So the British cavalry, not the best trained cavalry in the world, have something called deep formation. We can use these French cavalry, and we can imagine that they're British. Deep formation is represented by a unit arranged 2 bases wide and 3 deep. So you're looking at that. That would be considered a deep formation. Yeah, so that's a British deep formation. There are modifiers. They get a plus for movement, a plus for combat, and then people get a +1 to hit them with ranged, and it reduces their hand-to-hand factor by 1. Okay, before we go on to the next nation, I wanted to bring up this because I have the figures out here. Okay, so artillery is a little bit special when it comes to formations. Artillery really only have 2 formations. That is unlimbered and limbered. when you're unlimbered, you take your limber token and you put it off to the side. I like to keep it behind the artillery piece within about 6 inches. It's really non-existent. It doesn't really exist in space. It's just because it's scattered. It's not really in any kind of formation. They're just a clump of horses with limbered pieces in the back. And then the gun is ready to fire, right? That's unlimbered, ready to go. When it limbers up, what you would do is the front of the gun. This is the way I always do it. The front of the gun is replaced by the front of the limber. And then you just place the gun behind the limber. Now you'll notice this is a long base. That's deliberate. This base here is about half again as long as this. So you're looking at about 2.5 lengths to your artillery. And I base those on about an 80 millimeter. And I think that's the prescribed length. So I think this is like 6 inches. But either way, this is the actual unit. When you're moving, you measure from the front where the cannon was. Remember where the cannon was? And you drive it around as if it was in march column, right? It just flies around the table. And then when you get ready to unlimber, I do the exact same thing. I take the gun and I put it at the front of the limber, and then I move the limber back. Because the front of the unit is the only important piece of the movement and deploying of the artillery. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Hanover. They pretty much use all the same formations that the British do. Hanover is pretty much trained by the British, or KGL, cadre in there training them. So, like the British, the Hanover formations are 2 deep line. They can form column of companies, square, skirmish order, and column of march, which has all been discussed in the past. Landwehr is a special case. In my opinion, based on my research, Landwehr cannot form mixed formation. In the book, it says that they can and can't form mixed formation. So there are discrepancies in this book. But through my research, I'm saying no. They're normal field units, they're Jaeger units, they're light units. They can definitely form mixed formation. Landwehr cannot. So because of that, I just based every single model on the 4-figure model. Okay, so now when talking about Brunswick infantry, don't need to put any figures out. Brunswick infantry use mostly the French model. Okay, so they can form line, they can form attack column, they can do mixed formation, skirmish formation, square, column of march. Basically anything that the French can do, the Brunswickers can do as well. All right, the Netherlands, which would be the Dutch and the Belgians, a lot of times they're called Dutch-Belgian, but there are Dutch troops and there are Belgian troops, but they are all part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They use the French model as well. So you're looking at line, attack column, march column, mixed, square, skirmish, all the standard formations. Okay, so Nassau, which is actually one of my favorite nations, the Nassau are also French formations. So pretty much everybody's using the French rules except for the Hanover. So let's talk about Nassau. They're forming line, attack column, square, skirmish, and march column. All right, so now we're to the creme de la creme, the French, right? Understand that in 1815, which is what this book is really describing, the French army was not what it used to be. Like in 1812, the French were probably the elite of the elite, but when you get to 1815, you're now talking about a broken down army, underdeveloped, defunded army. So they might not have all the same capabilities that they used to have, but let's talk about what they can and can't do. Okay, so the infantry had a couple of formations that brigades would assume. Okay, so they can form attack column, we've seen. They can form line. And when in those formations, they can also do mixed formation with skirmishers. The French can also form the British column of companies if their elite companies are detached. Now, they normally fought in a 3 deep line formation, and that's represented by the regular line formation rule. So basically just, all 6 models all 6 bases side by side. Now, there is something called the order mixed, which is, or mixed order, and this would be a brigade order or formation. It's usually comprised of 1 or 2 battalions in line and a number of battalions in column. So let me see if I can show you what I'm talking about. A line in between and then a column to the side. This is considered order mixed. So you've got your column, you've got a line, and you have a column. And you can have either 1 or 2 battalions in line. And there's no special rules. This is just something that you gain both firepower and maneuverability when you're set up like this. So just as an aside, you would fire pretty good because you got a march column, which can fire, but it's poor. Not a march column, attack column. But you got a line that gets its full fire value. And then if for some reason you disorder a unit or get it to a position that maybe it's shaken or something like that, that's when you take these attack columns and you bring them in, because they'll have the extra maneuverability to be able to get in there. Okay, so now there is a unit that can be formed when you take a brigade's elite companies like the Voltigeurs or the Grenadiers, and you put all the Grenadiers into 1 battalion, and it becomes what's called a combined Grenadier battalion. And then you can take all the Voltigeurs and put them into another battalion called a combined Voltigeur battalion. And what that does is it gives you a couple more battalions for one thing, but what it also does is it reduces the strength of your line battalion, and then that's when that battalion is allowed to form the column of companies. Without doing that, you're not able to form the column of companies. You would only have the attack column and the march column. Now, French cavalry can fight in line and deploy in deep formation, like the British, or march column. Okay, and all these rules also apply for the Prussians, so you don't really need to go into all that. Okay, so now let's talk about the size of the units and how I base them. And what I'll do is we'll do that in the next video. I'm going to split this into a 2-part video because I noticed this video is going on extremely long. So I'll see you in the next video where we talk about the size of units and how I base them to accomplish the formations that are allowed in this video. Catch you in the next one.